The mental side of sports is something that is getting dramatically more attention and long overdue to do so. My friend Julie Kliegman's written a seminal work about this. I'm so excited to talk to her about Mind Game. She joins us today. Locked On Women's Basketball starts now.
Ogunbowale for the win. Good!
You are Locked On Women's Basketball, your daily podcast on women's basketball.
Happy Leap Day, everyone. I am Howard Megdal, welcoming you to Locked On Women's Basketball. Thank you for making us your first listen every day. Over 175,000 of you showed up in January alone, the way we show up for you 6 days a week. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. And of course, it is not just me, it is the incredible team over at The Next, including Julie Kliegman, by the way. Go to thenexthoops.com and you can subscribe, help support the writers, editors, photographers who are giving you over 100 reported pieces about women's basketball every month. I have looked at the calendar and it looks like there's going to be a couple of stories coming your way in March as well. I hear that's a big month for women's basketball, thenexthoops.com. And a big moment in my mind in the conversation, the discussion about mental illness in sports is here, thanks to Mind Game, Julie Kliegman's new book. It is being published next week. I think is the official release date. Is that right?
That's correct, March 5th.
You can go ahead and pre-order it now. Hit that link direct to the publisher. It is going to be in the show notes. Make sure you check it out. I had the privilege of reading this ahead of time. I say this not because you're my friend. I say this because I have seen this conversation and the way it has been playing out in media, across fandom, and through teams and players. This is going to change the understanding of how people think about mental illness in sports. And so when I go back to how comprehensive it is, as you go across men's, women's sports, we're going to focus a lot on the women's basketball part of this today. But, certainly, we were talking off air, you're talking to Bill Pulsifer, who was a idol of mine growing up, a Mets pitching prospect from 30 years ago. You talk to everyone. Just can you take me through what your overall process was to figure out who and how to include in this remarkable work?
Well, thank you. Yeah, I can take you through it, but it's kind of basically what you alluded to. I reached out to everyone. That was sort of the goal from the beginning, to not make it about one particular sport or one particular athlete, but to really do like a general kind of survey, if you will, of the landscape. And I know everyone has different stories to tell. It's all part of the same mosaic, but it's, everyone has their own unique thing going on. And I just wanted to get like a good cross section of what it's like to be an elite athlete dealing with mental illness or, other mental health and performance issues.
You wrote this, and I feel like this sums it up as well as anything. It's on page 76. These pioneers and it was Pete Harnish, you talked about, another Mets pitcher, to Bill Pulsifer, to Chamique Holdsclaw, to Royce White, to Michael Phelps, and way beyond, spanned decades and genders in sports, but they were all left without enough tools to handle their mental illness. That's the story again and again and again as you go back through the years. And before we get to where we are now here in 2024, I wonder how far away you think sports was from being able to handle this through the period of the last 30, 40 years.
Yeah, I think we've seen a lot of change in the past, I would say about 10 years in particular. But, as I kind of chronicled in the book, the history of sports psychology goes back more than a century, but it's a very start and stop kind of situation where People weren't really taking it seriously for various reasons. Certainly, in addition to athletes and coaches not really being open about this stuff, fans weren't ready to process it either. And so you really, when you talk about the last like 30 or 40 years, you really don't see, you see mentions here and there, and certainly individuals coming forward, but as a movement, it didn't really coalesce until much more recently.
The Babe Ruth story, which I want you to tell, I mean, is that, you talked about over a century, does that feel like a seminal moment where, no, for a lot of different reasons to the untrained eye compared to today, there wasn't an appropriate focus on Ruth and what it meant, but just the first sort of sense in a large scale way of the mental impact on sports day to day and performance?
I think for many people, Babe Ruth, and I'll say he was just kind of after a baseball game, he just kind of was like escorted over to a lab at Columbia and was just kind of like sitting for all these like performance-based tests. And I think that was an introduction for a lot of people, that specifically the Popular Science article that ran about it, that was an introduction for a lot of people to the world of sports psychology, because, who was a more famous athlete at that time than him?
Yeah. I mean, for sure. And so again, the test, it seemed like it was much more about hand-eye coordination and
That's
that
right.
aspect of it. But from there, it wasn't like a, let us say, birth of a new era of thinking about these things. I guess I wonder whether for you, as you go through these stories, and there's a lot of different, let us say, touch points as we think through the history of the way mental illness is addressed in American sports. Do you feel like there was a moment in time that's kind of the quote unquote birth of the modern era in thinking about it?
That's a good question. As much as you can pinpoint it to any person or any moment, I do think you have to look at Michael Phelps, just because of his level of fame and the depth in which he shared his struggles. For those who might be unfamiliar, Michael Phelps has said, the legendary swimmer has said that after just about every Olympic Games he participated in, he had this sort of come down afterward, and he was depressed. He wanted to kill himself. And he's, been very consistent about sharing that story. And I think that, as much as anything, is kind of a turning point or an inflection point.
You also spoke, of course, about Chamique Holdsclaw, and we're going to get more into her story in segment 2. But what was so interesting to me was and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems as if you talked about the challenges that men face as it relates to mental health, mental illness, and those questions are in some ways different and in some ways larger even within the overall framework of the sports scene. Take us through why that is.
Well, I think, unfortunately, people expect women to be emotional and expect women to not be able to handle challenges thrown their way. So that is, a huge problem. But at the same time, it left more room for women to be open about their mental illness and their struggles. Where, so we'll talk more about Chamique, but she faces a different challenge than someone like a Kevin Love or DeMar DeRozan might face in the men's game in the same sport. Men are expected to be tough. They can't cry. There's a whole bunch of stereotypes associated with that, especially if you're a Black man. So there's all these layers to the stigma associated with mental illness.
But it's this no win, right? It's because if you're women in sports, you have to overcome and push back against societal expectations. And if you're men in sports, you have to adhere to those societal expectations, right? There's no version of this that is actually a comfort level, a welcoming space for people who are dealing with these challenges.
That's exactly right. I mean, no matter who you are, it's certainly a journey.
A never-ending balancing act for sure. It is remarkable to read through. I mean, I could feel myself getting angry about the way people have been treated throughout the book. There's nothing dry about it. As comprehensive as it is, Mind Game, Julie, you've created a masterpiece. We have a lot more to talk about in segment 2. I can't wait to get into more of it. So we'll be right back to talk about it. Chamique Holdsclaw is where we're going to pick up. But first, I want to talk to you guys about our partners over at eBay Motors, and they have teamed up with Locked On Fantasy Basketball host Josh Lloyd to bring you some of the best fantasy picks all week, each week, all season long. Whether you're prepping for a daily draft or scanning the waiver wire, every week he's going to provide some players that are a guaranteed fit on your roster. Oh, eBay's guaranteed fit fantasy picks of the week. I see what you did there, eBay. There's a few who you really want to keep an eye on this week. Duop Reith, DeAndre Hunter. My number one is Dennis Schroeder. Of course, I had the privilege of covering early in his career. So Ben Simmons coming off the bench right now, and the Nets have 5 games next week. So Schroeder's going to get an opportunity to get starter minutes. Here's the thing you may not know if you didn't follow him since early in his career back in the Atlanta years. Dennis Schroeder is an elite three-point shooter now. Since he came over to Brooklyn, he is hitting almost 45% from downtown, and he's doing that on 4 attempts per game. So during this period of off-season for the New York Liberty, there is basketball being played at Barclays Center, being played by the Nets, and yes, being played by Dennis Schroeder. So Josh Lloyd can help you with your fantasy fit. eBay Motors can help you with your guaranteed fit for your car, which thank God eBay Motors, because I don't know how to find the right part for my car, but eBay Motors does. They have 122 million parts for your number one ride or die. You can make sure your ride stays running smoothly. Brake kits, LED headlights, roof rack bumpers, whatever you need, look for that green check, and it tells you that that fits your car. And at those prices, you cannot be beaten. So keep your car alive and thriving at ebaymotors.com. eBay guaranteed fit only available to U.S. customers. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. Dennis Schroeder shooting threes. Who knew? All right. So back with Julie Kliegman talking about Mind Game. And I just think you go back and you look at Chamique Holdsclaw, somebody who many people you talk to think was the greatest college player in the history of the game. Somebody who, when you first look back and you just look at the numbers, the stats alone, you'd say, wow, her pro career didn't measure up. Okay. But there's so much more to her story than that wasn't told at the time. Take us through, if you could, what people need to know, the top lines of her struggles and what she had to overcome playing professionally in the WNBA.
Right. So as you said, she comes out of Tennessee, coached by Pat Summitt, and is, this legendary prospect. And, she had a really hard road through the league because of what she classified at the time as depression, but would later come to be diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And that was after her retirement. So keep in mind, she's playing, she doesn't even have the right language for what she's dealing with. And so at one point in her career, she doesn't show up for a game and just kind of ends up taking time off and not letting anybody into her house, not even Pat. And then kind of later comes back and says it was depression. She also has a suicide attempt in her career. And then she retires, kind of stunning people a little bit early, I believe, from the Sparks. And, she makes clear at that time that for her, it wasn't about depression. It was about her love of the game and, that decision to step away. But the way she's talking about depression in that moment is kind of interesting. It's like she's overcome it for good, which is a language that a lot of people use and maybe for some people holds true. But for a lot of people, unfortunately, it doesn't. But she comes back to the league a few years later. And at that point, she told me it was the first time that any of her teams had put like on a whiteboard or anything like, hey, here's the number of a sports psychologist, or, here's what to do if you're struggling. And she has told me that she would have benefited a lot from hearing that earlier.
It didn't escape my notice, and we want to talk about the language around it too, but that the team where she finally was able to do this was coached by Sandy Brondello, and top executive was Dan Hughes, two people with real longevity in this league. That doesn't seem coincidental to me, that coaches and executives who are best able to understand mental illness as a part of the overall landscape are going to have the most success in a league like the WNBA, in any professional league as well. But did she talk about to you sort of why it was at that point in her career? Because there's again and again these stories of players who, and coaches too. Joanne McCallie, who has dealt with bipolar disorder, that they felt comfortable at the end or after the end of their careers to being able to even acknowledge it to those around them.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think there's definitely something to that, because when you're playing or when you're coaching, in Joanne's case, there's more at risk. Obviously, you don't want to lose your job. You don't want to be benched. You don't want to be traded, certainly. So there's a lot going on when you're in the thick of it. And afterward, or when you're close to the end, it's a bit easier to say like, hey, this is what I'm going through. And then you can kind of leave on your own terms.
This heartbreaking moment in Chamique's story where she's at Tennessee and she chooses not to meet with the school psychologist because she is the captain at that time. There's so many of these sort of hinge points. How much closer do you think we are to avoiding those types of, I mean, I know tragedy sounds like it's overstating, because Chamique was still with us because it was not a successful ability to intervene at that time, but she has managed to live her life ever since. But it's heartbreaking, for me, somebody so young, where maybe intervention at an earlier age could have led to a happier life. Do you think we are much closer to that, or do you think that so many people are just sort of living that truth 25 years later?
Well, what I'll say is that we're much closer to people having the option that Chamique did to meet with the sports psychologist. Mm-hmm. I don't know how close we are to everyone being willing to take up that offer the way that we hope that she might have, in another life. I think there's still a lot of work to be done to kind of like normalize this, for lack of a better word. But, certainly we're closer than we were in Chamique's day. So got to keep pushing.
It is great to see that. I also, again, want to go back to what you talked about, the language around it. You talked about this early in the book about using mental illness rather than mental health as the primary means of framing it. Take me through, and our listeners through, why that is so important.
Yeah, well, I think oftentimes we use mental health as kind of like a catch-all term, or, a kind of euphemistic term, because we're afraid of really labeling depression, anxiety, OCD, bipolar disorder, real illnesses like that. And I think certainly there are people who deal with mental health challenges that don't rise to the level of mental illness, but I think we're not doing ourselves any favors by conflating the two.
Mm-hmm. What do you think is the biggest lesson that those of us in the media need to learn about how we talk about, write about, think about mental illness?
Oh, there are so many lessons, but I think to try to boil it down, I think we need to just keep cultivating relationships with athletes, and that lend themselves to trust and openness, and kind of I understand that not every athlete is going to want to choose a journalist to tell their story. A lot of them go directly to Instagram or to a Players Tribune op-ed. But I think we need to do our part to make sure that we're open to telling these stories. We're not feeding into those stereotypes. We're using the appropriate labels and scientific context. We're talking to experts, and we're telling compelling stories that are true to those athletes.
I think also, and this is something I try to frame in my own mind, you cannot treat things as definitive, right? So
Right.
when you look at that New York Times quote from the time of Chamique's return, talking about that depression is beatable and that she
Right.
has done so, when we know that it is this sort of lifelong struggle.
Mhm.
It's really interesting to me. We need shades of gray, and I think that's important to think about as the world goes as well. So, all right, I want to talk about the future in segment 3 and where we go from here. So we'll be right back with Julie Kliegman talking more about Mind Game in just a moment. But first, I want to talk to you guys about Grammarly. And look, not all of you have the good fortune that I do, which is that Julie Kliegman edits for us over at The Next. And so she's able to make sure that my copy and the copy of all of our writers looks just right. So what do you do if you don't live with that luxury, the luxury of Julie? Well, I'm going to suggest that Grammarly gives you the opportunity to work more efficiently and feel more confident in your work. And you don't have to just take it from me. 96% of Grammarly users report that it helps them craft more impactful writing. Grammarly works across 500,000 apps and websites. By understanding your writing and context, it provides relevant, personalized suggestions. Their tone suggestions help you navigate even the most difficult work conversation. So make a bigger impact at work with Grammarly. Sign up and download for free at grammarly.com/podcast. That's GRAMMARLY.com/podcast. Easier said, done. I do feel sorry for people who don't work with Julie Kliegman, who is back here talking about Mind Game, which is a book you absolutely must read. It will change your understanding of the landscape of mental illness and American sports. I'm just no other way to put it. And I've thought about it a lot when I first got to read it, when you sent it me a couple of months ago, and I went back to it this week to help prepare once again, and it just has me thinking of it more and more. And so I'm going to put you in a position of power. Okay. You are the emperor of American sports.
Oh, boy.
I know, congratulations.
Thanks.
What are the most important elements that professional leagues and collegiate leagues, let's say, like the NCAA, can put into place to make the next generation of mental illness challenges more effectively helped with here in American sports?
Yeah, well, this is a lot of responsibility. I will try to,
You've got
take it
this.
well. Okay, thank you. I think professional leagues need to, be open-minded to bargaining with their players in terms of what mental health care they want to see and what is necessary for them. I know, like, preferences vary from team to team and player to player about the kind of support they want, whether they want it connected to the team or whether they just want more money to see outside professionals in the mental health space.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's one thing, is really just listening to the players on this front. In colleges, I think the NCAA could pay its players. I think that would honestly go a long way because, NIL is a great start, but when you're in college, you're dealing for a lot of people with financial barriers and just not feeling like you have the time or the energy either to kind of seek out the help you need, even if it is being presented to you. So I think, different levels of sport face different challenges, but on the whole, it's about making sure that money and resources are available for those who need it.
Yeah, no, it makes all the sense in the world. And again, obviously the critical part of that is not just having those resources available, but putting together a permission structure to be able to access those things as well. So certainly we could do a lot worse than having you as emperor of all of sports. So let's hope
Thank you.
get to that point. Julie Kliegman, the book is Mind Game. Do not miss this. There are certain volumes that you need to understand fully the way in which we need to change our thinking about the world. And this is one of them. I cannot put it any more strongly than that. So Julie, thank you for your time. To our listeners, thank you for making us your first listen every day. Fortunately, you guys get to upgrade in the host chair tomorrow. It is Jackie Powell, and she will be talking to Brendan Glasheen, who, of course, broadcasts for the Connecticut Sun, but more significantly at the moment is broadcasting over at Athletes Unlimited, which season starts today. So make sure you're checking that out any chance you get. Until next week, but until tomorrow for the show, I am Howard Megdal, wishing all of you a wonderful Thursday.
Ogunbowale for the win.
You are Locked On Women's Basketball, your daily podcast on women's basketball.